We now, the item for consideration is H.R. 1380, offered by Representative Quigley from Illinois. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife be discharged from further consideration of the bill. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I will now recognize the chair of the subcommittee, Mr. Huffman, to speak on the legislation. Sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So H.R. 1380, the Big Cat Public Safety Act, as you mentioned, introduced by our colleague, Mr. Quigley, is a common sense and much needed solution to address public safety and animal abuse concerns regarding private ownership and public contact with big cats. This is a bill that has, for a long time, had broad bipartisan support, and my hope is that we can now pass it into law. The Big Cat Public Safety Act would end the ownership of big cats as pets and prohibit exhibitors from allowing public contact with big cats, including cubs. People don't need to take selfies with big cats, and big cats should not be kept as pets. It's pretty simple. While the exact number is unknown, it's estimated that thousands of big cats, including lions, tigers, jaguars, leopards, cougars, and hybrids, are currently kept in private ownership in the United States. Since 1990, there have been around 300 dangerous incidents involving big cats in the U.S. that have resulted in human injuries, mauling, and even death. And when these incidents occur, first responders are put at risk since they are not trained or equipped to handle situations involving big cats. I hope we can all agree that privately owned big cats present an obvious and unnecessary risk to the public and to our first responders. In 2003, Congress unanimously passed the Captive Wildlife Safety Act, which amended the Lacey Act to prohibit the import, export, buying, selling, transport, receiving, or acquisition of big cats across state lines and our border. However, the existing law did not include prohibitions for the private possession of breeding of big cats. And currently, our state laws vary quite a bit on this subject. Some have no restrictions at all. Some simply require registration, and some completely prohibit the ownership of big cats as pets. So the Big Cat Public Safety Act is needed. It builds on the Captive Wildlife Safety Act by making it illegal to privately possess or breed lions, tigers, leopards, cheetahs, jaguars, cougars, or any hybrid. And the bill is narrowly focused on privately owned animals. It includes exemptions for exhibitors with USDA Class C licenses, and that would include zoos, state universities, and sanctuaries. So again, this is a bipartisan bill. It is definitely necessary, and it is time that we pass it into law to protect the public from unnecessary harm and ensure humane conditions for these majestic big cats. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Huffman. Anyone else?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Gosar.
Yeah, I stand in opposition to 1380. Once again, this is the federal's intercedence of picking winners and losers. Frankly, this is a handout to the Association of Zoos, Aquariums, and Democrat favorite Dan Ash. This pits small zoos against large zoos, and frankly, pits a contradiction between the policies of the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Interior. This bill injects the Department of Interior into regulating actions that are outside of its purview and, frankly, should not even be heard by this committee. This is an issue for the Agricultural Committee to consider. With this contradiction, it is especially troubling that no federal witnesses were called to testify at the legislative hearing on this bill. 1380 is opposed by the Zoological Association of America, and with that, I'd like to enter into the record a letter supporting my position. They quote, H.R. 1380 represents an unwarranted federal intrusion into the rights of responsible wildlife exhibitors and will have significant negative impact on federally licensed zoological facilities, as well as many small and family-owned businesses. End of quote. I therefore ask my colleagues to vote against this bill.
Is there further debate before we begin the amendment process?
Yeah, I will.
Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, sir. The obvious statement is there's more than one way to skin a cat. But I won't make it because that's too obvious. It's too low of a joke. However, you are absolutely right. What this does is pit one group, big zoos, against small zoos. It also is written in a unique way, bizarre way, to involve the Department of Interior and Agriculture so that it can come, I'm assuming, to this committee. But that's a major conflict. And if implemented, this bill will be a major conflict. It's also, even though it's called the Big Cats Public Safety Act, it's not just about big cats, because it references every species within the body of this particular bill, and we're creating a conflict of how you administer between two branches of government, between two different agencies, and also that it covers every species, not just big cats. So with that, this is not a well thought out piece of legislation. May pass because the votes are here, and even though no one's actually heard the debate, it may pass anyway. But it is taking us in the wrong direction, and that's another bad cat pun, and I'm not going to use that. Yield back.
Debate on the, before we begin the amendment process? If not, I recognize Ranking Member Bishop. You have the next amendment. Bishop number 2, you recognize, sir.
Thank you. Has this been passed out? I guess it's being passed out now. As it's being passed out, and as I'm listening to other bad cat puns coming from this side of the aisle, it is, and they keep coming. Amendment's really simple. It simply strikes the number of additional requirements that go above and beyond those currently required by USDA permits. If it's Class C facility, that is required. But this underlying bill simply adds a whole bunch of other stuff that has to be in there, which creates a conflict. It's a jurisdictional conflict between USDA and Fish and Wildlife Service. I don't know if that was done by design. It's the only reason this bill is in front of this committee, because otherwise it would be in front of the Agriculture Committee. But if our goal is to strengthen the USDA permit requirements, then we ought to do it the right way. This bill does not do it the right way. This is simply an end run around other committees' jurisdiction, kind of a mockery if you actually think of the process and procedure we're going through, and bad procedure produces bad policy, which is exactly what we're doing. So at least strike out the litany of extra requirements that are put in there that will be regulatory conflicts between two agencies coming into the future. So if you vote against this amendment, which I can't imagine why anyone would want to do that, you are voting for regulatory conflict in the future between battling agencies of government. I urge your adoption of my amendment. Yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion? Mr. Huffman?
Mr. Chairman, I do oppose this amendment. The provisions that the ranking member would strike, that he describes as unnecessary and redundant regulatory requirements, are actually the heart of this bill that makes sure that the people who handle these big cats actually know what they're doing and know how to protect public safety and know how to protect the animals themselves. This is not, as was said a moment ago, a question of small zoos against big zoos. If you want to think of it as a contest between zoos, it would be real zoos versus fake zoos, or good zoos versus bad zoos. Many of the so-called small zoos who are opposing this bill have a terrible record of inhumane and unsafe practices in standards. So, no, if you vote for this amendment, you're actually voting to have lax or no standards for who gets to maintain and exhibit these big cats, and you're voting to allow more, unfortunately, tragic events where public safety is put at risk, first responders are put at risk, and animal welfare is allowed to be put at risk. So I request a no vote.
Back. Any further discussion on the amendments? Mr. Gosar?
Yeah, I yield to the ranking member.
I'm sorry. Thank you. I appreciate the yield because I need to contradict what was just said. It's not totally inaccurate. many of the procedures, some of the procedures that are placed into this new litany of things it can do are new things that do not add to the safety protection of animals. For example, you have a provision in there that allows for a licensed veterinarian or student to accompany a veterinarian, which is good, but then has an or, and that anyone directly supporting conservation programs of the entity or facility can have direct contact with these particular, anyone that wants to go in there, they're a donor, they simply have to, this empowers them to do it. That's part of the regulatory conflict. USDA does not allow that. We are actually implementing a new kind of conflict, that's not limited to those who know what they're doing, but anybody who has a conservation bent or has a donor to a facility. That's why this is a poorly written bill. And that's why this section is the section that ought to be relieved from the bill. I yield back to Mr. Gosar.
And I yield.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion? Hearing no further debate, the question is on the amendment offered by Representative Bishop, designated as number 2. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Lousy opinion.
And the amendment is not agreed to.
And roll call.
Recorded vote has been requested and postponed pursuant to prior announcement. Now,